Well, I wanted to start with a little bit more of a general overview of reputation and perhaps what this means to scholars. And I wanted to pause a moment and look at a definition. So I think the important thing to remember about reputation is that we're talking a lot about metrics here today, but it's a complex word, and there are qualitative values attached to it as well. And I think this rich mix is a really good thing, because I think we all know that single measures of performance are extremely limiting. We know that with the impact factor, perhaps it creates challenges and focus on the wrong things. And I think few would disagree that we need to find new, more sophisticated ways to assess scholarly impact. I think the question, though, as Paul has discussed, is what should we measure? And this is a question addressed by David Nicholas and colleagues in their Science and Policy report on emerging reputation mechanisms for scholars. And in this study, David refers to Boyer's model, which was developed in 1990 and updated in 2011 to include this last point, knowledge production and dissemination. And this model gives an overview of what it is to be a scholar. So it covers discovery, integration, application, teaching and dissemination. So perhaps then new measures of reputation should align with these areas. So at Kudos, we contributed to that study that David Nicholas and his team did by circulating a survey to our users. So this is some of the results from that survey that I'm going to share with you today. It's David's work, but he's happily given me permission to share some of this with you. And obviously you can read the report that he produced as well. So these are some of the demographics of the responses that we received, some 250, a fairly mature age group too, average age 47, and from many different countries and different subject areas. So I'm going to focus on 5 questions that came out of that survey that I think are particularly key and relevant. And this is the first one in terms of what researchers think contribute to their scholarly reputation right now, what they think is important. So what you're looking at are the blue and the red bars. These are very important is blue and important is red. And somewhat encouragingly, thank goodness, conducting research comes out at the top of that. That's what they feel should be counted towards their reputation. And then underneath that, we've got disseminating research results through journals, articles and books, and collaborating in research. So I don't think there's any surprises there. But looking down this list, there were some things that jumped out a little bit at me, perhaps as being a little bit more surprising. If we look at popularization of scholarship, it's about 2/3 of the way down. Something like 60% of scholars are saying, my efforts to do this should count towards my reputation. Something else that I found interesting, particularly with the emergence of all these new sort of sharing networks and so on, is dissemination of research via social networks. That one is 4th from the bottom, and some 45% of scholars feel that their efforts to do that should count towards their reputation. Even disseminating research by sort of blogging and tweeting chalks up something like 25%. I mean, there's a bit of a bias here in that these are Kudos users. There may be some sort of social media sort of savviness there. But nevertheless, a quarter of people saying this is something that could be really important and should contribute towards how I'm perceived. The next question was really, I think, particularly interesting, because we then asked researchers to give us their perceptions of what their employers thought counted towards their reputation. So this isn't what their employers actually think, but it's what they think their employers, their institutions think. And what you're looking at here is the red bar is what the researchers think their employers would say was important or very important, and the blue bar is what the researchers feel is important or very important. And I've then ordered these by gap size. So if we sort of dwell for a moment on the biggest gaps, these top ones here in the list, peer reviewing comes top of that. So So something like 80% of researchers say this is important, it should contribute towards my reputation. But they believe that significantly less, just over 40% of their institutions value that as much as they do. In terms of serving one's community through activities like society posts and so on, again, this is something that researchers put a lot more emphasis on than they believe their employers value. Things like producing literature reviews, textbooks, educational materials, incredibly important in our world for the communication and sharing of knowledge. Again, they feel this isn't something their employers recognise as much as they believe the value to be. Two of the things that interest me around this, particularly coming with my sort of kudos hat on, is the dissemination of research by social networks and also the dissemination of research results via conferences. Again, the researchers feel their employers don't value that as much as they do. This whole sort of area of outreach, which seems to me a really critical part of what doing research is all about, the communication of it, but maybe that's not being recognised by employers. The other areas that the gap sort of closes down, the only area where the gap is in reverse is in that last point, administration and management. Here researchers feel that their employers overvalue that in terms of how that relates to their reputation. So let's look at social media metrics in a little bit more detail. And the question was asked, should these be counted towards your scholarly reputation? And what we see here is a bit of a divided camp, I think. We have a third agreeing, we have a third disagreeing, and we have a third who don't know. So there's a lot of uncertainty, I think, over the value of those metrics. But still, a third is not insignificant. To say how people are talking, sharing, discussing my work, how it is being picked up by the media is something that should be tracked in terms of my reputation. We can dig into this a little bit more deeply by looking at some of the free text responses we had to this question as well. So out of the third that said this should not count towards my reputation, these are typical of some of the responses that we had. And you can see there's a sort of mix here of a worry that those metrics are prone to manipulation, a sense that this kind of outreach is just about publicity. This comes up quite a lot, actually, this idea that popularity doesn't mean quality. And also this idea that my work should stand on its own, it should be out there in the ether, people should be reading it and citing it, and it should have impact, and if it's good enough, it will. Which I think is becoming an increasingly challenging attitude when we think about the volume of content that's now available. So that's some of the naysayers. In terms of the yay-sayers, those that said this is important, these metrics should be taken into account, we see a different story. Very much sort of focused on visibility is a must. I want more people to read my work. Today we have so many more channels to communicate what we do beyond the sort of the publication. We should be using them. And also the emergence of this idea of surely communication is a core part of the research process, and we need to give more emphasis to this, and I want to take more responsibility for that. So that's some of the free text responses that we had. We then asked a little bit more information about what kind of specific metrics to do with you or your publications do you particularly value. What I found really interesting about this question is that article level metrics actually pipped the impact factor at the Post just. And I wonder if this would have been the same even a year ago, I don't know. But according to the respondents to our survey, they weight that level of metric at the individual output level more strongly than they do the journal impact factor. So that was interesting. They also rate those kind of metrics related to an individual piece of output more highly than they do that output in aggregate. So scores like the H-index, author-based scores around their collective of work, are lower down in terms of their importance to researchers compared to the performance of their individual pieces of work. I think that's quite interesting as well. And all those three things sit above things like reputation of their institution. Obviously, they want to feel their work stands on its own merits, regardless of who they work for. But quite a strong score for public interest in their work, and perhaps that's being more driven by funders these days, looking for public engagement. So the final question that I'm going to talk through here today is researchers' views on the idea of reputation management systems or platforms and tools to do more of this kind of work to increase their visibility. And in terms of thinking how important these are going to become in the future, there's a very strong wave of opinion shown by the responses to our survey that this is going to become a very important part of the research process in the future. So the blue and the red segments here are people scoring out of 5. Yes, absolutely, these are going to become really important in terms of how my career progresses in the future. So I think I just want to finish with a final quote, which is also from our survey. I think my sort of personal view is that reputation management is going to become a lot more important because visibility is becoming more difficult. So outreach as well as publishing will need to have greater effort around it. And obviously, because we can measure a lot more now, we surely will. I was reflecting after Pam Dixon's great talk earlier of these 250 indicators of my personality as a consumer and thinking, my gosh, what will the research world look like if we have that number of indicators, and who will use it and for what purposes? And there are some interesting discussions to be had around that. I think what's particularly interesting to me about this research is the disconnect with what researchers feel they should be evaluated against compared to their employer and their institution's view. And clearly, whatever indices we decide are going to be important in the future, it will help if we bring those two groups together so that everyone's working towards a common goal. So I hope you found that information useful. Do read David Nicholas's great report, and thank you very much.